All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is a brief overview of hospitality. So, hospitality, a brief history, and we go through the olden day time periods, get an idea of how hospitality came about, how we began to call it hospitality, all the way up to the current time frame as it stands here in the 2000s. As we look then at the beginning of hospitality, this dates back to the colonial period of the 1700s. It's at the time of war, depression, all the way through the recent recession, the technology and sociocultural changes which are affecting our industry in this day and age. So really, it spans a very long time period. Only recently have we begun to study it as a discipline in academia. Instead, before it was just more of a object of humanity more than anything. So the modern hospitality, like I said, recent to the study of academia, and is what we know of it in the 1950s and 60s and moving forward. But important to look at what happened beforehand to understand how hospitality was first defined, and then how we define it today as well. So the word hospitality in its own self derives from the word hospice. When we think of hospice, we may think of the hospice care that our elders are getting generally before they're dying from a terminal illness or something in that regards. We think of it through this medical route. So interesting to note that really the hospitality industry and the medical industry, the hospital industry, kind of derive from the same purpose in life, and that is to provide for the sick and weary and to care for those of us who are traveling. So you'll note then that in the word hospice, that HOSPI is in hospital and it's also in hospitality. So a very close linking of those words. Though we think our industries may be much more wide and diverse, they come from that same care identity. So early hospitality, then, we can link that all the way back to the Greek and Roman culture in 40 before Christ. And it was given for a social and a religious purpose. So a lot of times people going on religious journeys were are some of our first travelers. And so while they would go on those journeys, they would need a place to stay, to care, to get a meal, to continue on and forge through their journey. And that goes on further than to the Roman era, in which the businessmen traveled, seeking the their finances and their natural gains from their travels. In addition to that, the Romans were the first intended in history, the study of anthropology, to see how they traveled from place to place for the pure act of pleasure in addition to business. So that whole idea of what we know as travel today, that vacation idea of travel, there's a great movie out there called Shirley Valentine. It's a little bit old school, but I watched it here as a stout student back in the mid 2000s. So it gives that idea of what pleasure travel is all about, and what we think as is indeed hospitality. After the Roman Empire, then hospitality fell primarily to religious orders. This is still something you see very often today. Churches opening their doors to the homeless, to the traveler, to the sick, the weary, the transient population in our world. Transient, of course, being those people who move from place to place. And so, in addition to having homeless shelters, in the time of the Roman era, they would simply provide for those who were traveling through the area and needed a moment and a place to stay. You can think of in the movie Les Miserables, or if you've seen the play in itself as well too, you can think of the main character, the protagonist of the film, who also fell sick and weary and into the church, only to then steal and find his way into purity thereon. Great story, Les Miserables. It also has that connection to hospitality, oddly. Then we move on to the medieval period. This is where we really begin to see travel in its pleasure form the most. You see a lot of people moving by stagecoach or carriage. That becomes the most favorite type of transportation. They're moving from home to home. They're taking up fortnight at these homes and impressing upon the host to then impress upon them a spirit of hospitality. So at this time, the English are very famous for their tea, but they're also famous for the coffee house effect. So the nobility and who would come through these stagecoaches would stay in monasteries. The average layperson would stay in private homes known as inns, and there they would provide them hospitality. So a couple of the major elements of or symbols of hospitality to keep in mind, one of which being pineapple. We use this a lot in our hospitality schools to identify hospitality because it is the major symbol of hospitality worldwide. The nobility in England were keen on travel, and when they would travel to somewhere such as Latin America or to Africa, they would bring back with them exotic fruits, of which of most importance was the pineapple. This pineapple then was given to nobility as they stayed in homes and traveled with them, and became this offering of hospitality that you'd have. You'd give this finest of fruits to those who are traveling, those who you're taking care of. Similarly, coffee worldwide has become a symbol of hospitality. There are pictures which date back all the way back to this medieval period and before that contain some form of coffee, and always willing to burn. So one of the first things you do in hospitality, if you're hosting someone in your house, especially in these types of inns in the medieval period, was to offer them a beverage. And most often that was coffee, because the individual would come to you sick and weary and tired and would be in need of a stimulating beverage. And so oftentimes it was coffee. Furthermore, you can look at the connection, we won't get into it too much, but you can look at the connection of coffee to revolutionary periods like that of the French Revolution and Les Miserables, as it characterizes it, and also in England as this revolutionary beverage, which was a resistance to the general movement of England. They were seen as the socialites, the creative among us. Interesting to note how that kind of sticks to the idea of cafes today, that it's still these intellectuals gathering to communicate their ideologies and also to have a stimulating beverage to engage those conversations. But I digress on that and move forward to the colonial period. So this is really when all of the public engages in tourism for the first time. Again, most tourism was originally studied under the discipline of anthropology, anthropology being the movement of people over time. And so thereafter we began to study tourism, and we noted during this period, the 1600s, that coaches of people, stagecoaches serving more than one individual, one family, would be the primary sense of movement. We'd have the travel for individual purpose and for pleasure, for business, all types of travel, really. And these stagecoaches, again, would stop at certain inns, which now would become what are called coach inns, or more public style of inns, getting closer to that idea of the hotel that we know and love today as well. So these are built along the major routes as we begin to develop legitimate roads throughout England, throughout Europe, and throughout the world as well. People then would stop at these inns, and inn simply meaning a sleeping accommodation. They would stay for a night, a few nights, an extended stay, but the service and the hospitality would be in a more formalized setting than what it was previously. Again, in that medieval period, if we go back to that, it was more so in private homes and a one-on-one connection. Now we're looking at groups of people traveling to the same place at the same time.